Okay. Anyhow, we're up to session 4. So we did the rise of Islam last week, and I'm going to be addressing the topic of Islam again in the 6th session. But today and next session, we'll concentrate most formally on Western Europe and its attempt to dig itself out of the so-called Dark Ages, and we'll see what they were getting up to in this period. We left last week at the middle of the 8th century with the rise of the Abbasids and pushing the Umayyads into the Emirate of Cordoba. And I want to pick up mid-8th century again with the rise of the Carolingian Empire. So with that said, in fact, before I do anything else, I need my little annotation, my bouncing ball, as Harold calls it. Okay, here we go. And let me move that out of the way. So here we are in the West at the accession of Charlemagne, Charles the Great, Karl the Grosse. The most famous of all of the medieval potentates, because he's a link between the ancient world and the High Middle Ages, and he's seen as a quasi-mythic figure, actually. He was an incredible character. We'll get a chance to talk about him a bit. But we're looking at a map in approximately 771 AD, or Common Era. And I've boxed the map into zones just to give us a preliminary overview. And the first zone in red is what we would now call England, Ireland, and Scotland, the British Isles. So we have, in this period, Angles, Saxons moving into what we would think of as England proper, and shoving the Britons into Wales and into Brittany in France. They were a Celtic group that had been there since the Roman period. We have the Irish Celtic groups moving into Ireland. The Picts are the Scottish Gaelic Celtic group. The Welsh and these other groups had been very recently Christianized, with strenuous efforts coming from Rome, among other places. So Irish monasteries are at the heart of the early conversions and are an outpost of Greek scholarship, oddly enough. And I'll try to address that a little later on. So the only high culture that still included Greek in its curriculum, and just a couple of minor samplings of it, are in Ireland, of all places. And they actually produce a Neoplatonic philosopher by the name of John Scotus Erigena. Oh, excuse me for a second. A dog is scratching at the door, wants to get in. Taking care of that problem. The Irish and English monasteries, which were of two different types, the original Celtic monasteries and the Benedictine ones that came in later, are both going to sponsor missions to the continent. So the Germans, the Saxons, Slavs, their conversion is going, as we'll see, is going to be executed by English and Irish monks coming over from the islands. We'll see how that works when we get there. In the kingdom of the Franks, the realm of the Franks, it's still the Merovingian kingdom until Charlemagne's grandfather arrives at the scene, father and grandfather. The new dynasty that Charlemagne's family establishes are called, and using their German name, the Arnulfings, or sometimes referred to as the Pippinids because of Pippin, the father of Charlemagne. The man who led the army that stopped the Umayyad incursion through Spain and into France in the 730s was Charles Martel, and from at the famous Battle of Tours, was his grandfather, was Charlemagne's grandfather. So this is a very ambitious family dynasty, and we'll see how they utilize papal connections to establish their legitimacy, because the Merovingian dynasty before them had been anointed. They are the sacred kings of the Franks, and to displace them, the Carolingian family is going to need a legitimating device, and they're going to use the papacy for this, as we'll see. Spain is largely now under the control of the Umayyad Emirate. They have very little contact with what we would call Europe in the north, but they do have a lot of contact with local Christians, because the borderlands, some Christian monarchies use the Pyrenees and the Basque Coast to retreat to, and they are never overwhelmed by Muslims. And it will take 7 centuries, but we'll see that the so-called Reconquista, the Christian reconquest of the Iberian Peninsula, will move slowly but surely from north to south through the early into the high Middle Ages. And it isn't really until the last gasp in 1492 that Spain has finally succumbed to the Christians at a price, and we'll look at that price. So the Abbasids are still going to claim North Africa, even though they have very little suzerainty over it. Basically, they're restricted, their control is restricted to Western Asia, the Near East, Egypt, and the like. Italy, as we see in this little orange box over here, is in control, under the control of the Lombards, both in the north and the south, northern duchies and southern duchies, with papal control, with Frankish support of the middle of the country, parts of Lazio, Umbria, all the way through the Marche to the other coast. And that will be a big bone of contention moving forward. Eastern Europe, which I don't highlight here, but I'll just point to mention, is dominated by various Khans, the Bulgars along the Danube, the Avars, Slavs to the north, Balts to the north of them. And these tribes are going to be an issue to Charlemagne insofar as they can press up against the east part of the Frankish realm, as, for instance, the Duchy of Bavaria here is already there. They will impinge on Saxony, and we'll see how that happens. But they're much more an issue for the Byzantine Empire, because they want to press southwards directly to the Mediterranean. Between Byzantine control, and it's going to be short-lived, of Sicily and the southern toe and heel of Italy and Corsica, and the Abbasid and Umayyad control of the Western Mediterranean, the West is largely cut off from the sea. So basically, one of the underlying and powerful reasons for the primitive material level of existence in Western Europe in the so-called Dark Ages of the 6th, 7th, and 8th centuries, is that they are cut off from the major existing trade routes to the wealthier parts of the world, which would be Constantinople and the Islamic centers. Moving along. So Europe needs to be Christianized. The Germans are largely pagan. The ones who made it across the Danube and the Rhine either adopted Arian Christianity, and as did the Goths that we've mentioned a couple sessions ago, the Ostrogoths and Visigoths in Spain, or as did the Franks, there was a conversion to Catholicism in a way of, as a method for attracting old Latin support for their primacy in the region. So most of the Germans, and the new arrivals certainly, are all pagan. And the primary instrument in their conversion was Irish monasticism. And the Irish monks derived their tradition from the austere Egyptian, Eastern Mediterranean tradition that John Cassian had brought to Gaul, to southern France, Lorraine, in the 5th century. This was the tradition of the Desert Fathers, those austere pillar sitters and the ascetics who liked to, among other things, found their monasteries in the most ascetic and unlikely places. And I have a picture in the lower right of this slide of Skellig Michael off the coast of Ireland, which had one of their now archaeological site, but one of their monasteries. And this was used, do you remember the scenes in the last Star Wars that was done with Skywalker as an older man, and he's isolated on this rock, and it's on Skellig Michael, and that very harsh-looking moonscape is the sort of place that the Irish monks would choose for their hardy existence, or bare hardy existence. I have no idea how they were supported. I mean, people must have brought them grain and whatever, but I have no idea how they got through their winters and the like. But their monastic practice was extremely ascetic. They did live in groups, so they were Cenobites, they weren't hermits, even though there were some hermits among them. And I name one famous one, Cuthbert of Lindisfarne, the famous Cuthbert from the 7th century, whose body, I cannot help some of the monastic lore of this, these wildly exaggerated miracles. Was his body, according to the chronicler Bede, was perfectly preserved even 11 years after his death. And we have the monks shrouding the body of Cuthbert. And they would move the body around even after its decay. When they were running away from Vikings, they would load up the bones and have a golden reliquary casket and take it to the next place. So these monasteries owed a lot to a founder named Columba. And a lot of the mission movement owes a lot to, he's one of the patron saints of Ireland. He's a leading light in the movement to export Christianity. And this little map, which I only include here to show you all the little green crosses, these are all places which Irish monks established as missionary centers in the Dark Ages. We have nothing left of their monasteries on the mainland. You have to remember, there's virtually no stone building done in that period until you get to at least 800, at least to Charlemagne's time. do we have vestiges of any stone buildings. And one of the reasons why in this class, for instance, I won't be showing the sort of exemplary architecture in Western Europe that I will when I'm looking at Byzantium or the Muslim centers, is that the material poverty just precluded building in substantial media like stone. They could do it, but the wealth wasn't there to support it, as we'll say. So the Picts in Scotland are converted. Several abbeys are found. And here's one of the earlier, but this building is probably from the 9th century, of Iona, one of the Columban establishments. In the 7th and 8th century, the monks create many missions to convert particularly the West Germans, the Frisians, along the coast of these are people in areas that would now be considered part of the Netherlands, for instance, or Belgium. The Book of Kells, though, was created around the year 800 at a Columban abbey, and that is an astonishing work, which I show you some examples of to give you a sense of how high the artistic and intellectual culture within the Irish monasteries could be. The Book of Kells is now in Dublin at Trinity. And if we do close-ups of some of this stuff, some of the work on either covers or illuminations was just astonishing and rivals anything that you'll see being done in Constantinople, for instance. The 4 evangelists with their symbols. Detail from a page, from a manuscript page, more detail from a manuscript page. They clearly knew what they were doing. They were clearly in touch with higher traditions, which will degrade in the 9th and 10th centuries. Irish culture was at a high point in the earlier period than in the later period. Somebody is asking what a kell is. Frankly, I don't know. Let's Google that later. I don't know. I thought it was a place name. I had always assumed it was a place name, but I am not sure. The color alone is so startling. What they used for that is, and like I said, the Irish monasteries went into a decline after the 8th century, and probably because of the dominance of Benedictine monasticism and the papal support for that in England proper and on the continent proper. And so there wasn't much support being offered by the papacy, certainly, to continue the Irish traditions or the Celtic traditions after that. The Carolingians, the rise of the Carolingians. So the movement from mayor of the palace to kingship. So the Merovingians before them had established a monarchy all the way back in the time of Clovis at the end of the 5th century. But by 600, their control was pretty ceremonial. The real power, people who controlled much larger estates and therefore wealth and therefore manpower, was in the hands of court ministers who were called mayors of the palace. And Charles Martel, in the late 7th, early 8th century, is one of those. He's the victor over the invading Muslims at Tours, and he effectively ruled the kingdom of the Franks as the mayor. His son Pepin the Short, finally deposes the last Merovingian because they can't maintain what is really a ruse much longer, and will then use papal influence to establish legitimacy. We have a cauldron. Kell definition, a cauldron. Okay. Anyhow, the Carolingians used the church, and they did so quite deliberately by informally inviting English and Irish saints to convert the Germans, to place themselves under the sponsorship of the papacy in doing it, and to use that as a device to in turn be anointed as the new inheritors of the throne. So Boniface, the most famous of them, and literally the doer of good, Bonifacio, apostle of the Germans. He's actually Winfrid. He's an English Benedictine. We have a manuscript vision of him both baptizing. This is from the monastery that he founds in Germany, in Fulda, the Eastern Franks. And here is his martyrdom for the cause. His conversions of the Saxons are useful to their political aims. His strong papal backing gave him leverage because the church could bless their usurpation of the throne. They cement their political dominance by giving land grants to their supporters, and many such were church property. So there's this tension will begin right at the beginning of the Carolingian Empire. Since the church controls a lot of property, beginning even in this period, the contention will be between the secular power, the temporal power, the king or an emperor or a duke, depending on where we are, and the local bishops or the papacy, who gets to control giving away church property. Of course, the secular crown wants to do it because they can, in countries that are beginning to develop the feudal model, which we will talk about next week. Whoop, I didn't mean to do that. They want to use church property as a trade-off that they can give to followers of those. In 753, the Lombards are threatening Rome and central Italy. The Pope flees to the Franks and implores Pepin to step in. He comes in, he takes Ravenna from the Lombards and gives it to the Pope, the actual sort of first step in creating the papal states. The Pope anoints Pepin, and we have a picture of it here, and adds his sons to the patrimony. He says, it's going to be a family inheritable title that he makes it. And it's a quid pro quo. So the kingship has been legitimized in exchange for protection, the papal states and privilegium, exemptions of church property given to the papacy. So indeed, there'll be some of the abbeys as a concession will be freed from temporal control and politically appointed bishops and given back to the papacy. So two things are accomplished in this exchange. The papacy is freed from its reliance on Byzantine support now that it has Frankish support. And number two, the idea of a theocratic monarchy has been established, a monarchy that is blessed by God. So Charlemagne himself, born in 748, is going to become king of the Franks in 768. By the way, this little symbol up here is part of his signature. He actually wrote this very elaborate signature that this is only part of it, the symbol that started it all. It's Carolus, K-R-L-S, if you will. He becomes king of the Franks in 768. He becomes king of the Lombards in 774 because he invades and conquers them. And he gets crowned emperor of the Romans in the year 800, an event that has quite an important significance in the history of Western Europe. And I'll talk about that in a slide or two. He regards himself as the protector of Christianity and as the, if you will, the throwback or inheritor of Constantine's model of the Holy Roman Emperor. And all through medieval and later history, he is always cited as the model. And so in art, until we get to Napoleon, and even when we get to Napoleon, the model of the French king, the man who is the state. Remember Charles de Gaulle's L'État c'est moi, the state is me. Charlemagne could have said L'État c'est moi, the state was him. Here's a reliquary bust in Aachen, the palace city that he used most as his capital, even though it was a moving capital, which I'll make a comment on later. And I down here have a portrait of him by Dürer. Both the Germans and the French see Karl de Grosse as the founder of their empires, because the Franks were literally the ancestors of both those who we call West Germans and those who we would call the French. He's at war with somebody or other for his entire life. He's at war for almost half a century. He is constantly in the field. He's a charismatic leader. He's a successful warrior. And the old German model of followers, one's Gefolge, one's Comitatus, looking for a successful military leader is still intact. And I'm going to make the point later that this is, when we talk about the Carolingian Empire, we're talking about a stage in European development that is halfway, or maybe not quite halfway, between roaming tribal bands on one hand, nomadic tribal bands on one hand, and a set of established national states with legalistic and bureaucratic infrastructure on the other hand, which we'll get to really in the 12th and 13th centuries. But right now, it looks, and we're going to see a couple of maps, which will make us think that there is if you will, a nation. The Kingdom of the Franks is sort of France to be, but really not quite, because it doesn't have the social, economic, political infrastructure that we presuppose when we talk about a real state. So he invades, as an ally of the Pope, he invades the Lombard kingdom, adds them to the Frankish Empire, but it's really the northern Lombards. He makes an attempt on the southern Lombards, the Duchy of Benevento. Remember, the Lombards tended to divide the country into 30-something duchies, and Benevento in the south, which was one of their most powerful ones, does not succumb. He invades He tried to take control of the Pyrenees, Vasconia, the land of the Basques. He does establish a certain level of suzerainty, but the Basques never accept Charlemagne and Frankish domination. And in fact, I put this little aside in because it becomes so famous later on. The Basques ambushed Charlemagne's army at Roncevaux and killed the knight Roland, whose legend, the Song of Roland, defined the model later on as a legend in the chivalric literature of the 12th century, establishes this model of the code of chivalry and becomes the storyline that inspires both the Song of Roland and the Italian Orlando Furioso later on. He conquers Corsica and Sardinia, sort of, but conflicts with the Emirate of Cordoba leads him into contact with the Caliphate in Baghdad because he sees a threat in Spain, Corsica, and Sardinia. He decides, well, maybe I can outflank them. The classic, the enemy of my enemy is my friend, and he sends a delegation to Baghdad. And let's see, we have a, thank you, Jeff, points out that there are lots of operas based on Orlando Furioso. Yes, there are. So he sends a delegation to Baghdad using as a diplomat Isaac Judaeus, Isaac the Jew, who we know very little about other than that he had been born into the land of the Franks and may have been recommended because there may have been a linguistic facility in Aramaic and maybe other Eastern Mediterranean languages. I don't think Hebrew would have been used as a demotic language at this point in time. I think it was still more of a liturgical language, but he may have been chosen because he would be able to speak Syriac or Aramaic with representatives of the Abbasid Caliph Harun al-Rashid, who, by the way, sends a pet elephant, Abu Abbas, the famous Abu Abbas, back to Charlemagne. So in the kingdom of the Franks, there would have been this wonder of wonders, an elephant. I'm not even sure whether it was an African elephant or an Asian. It's probably an Asian elephant being sent back. God knows how they got it there, to Francia. So he dominates southern France, Aquitaine, Provence, and southern, I'll begin to call it Francia at this point. He conquers the lands held by the East Saxons and the Bavarians and converts them, and so brings the Franks right up against the Avars and the Slavs in Eastern Europe. And he also precipitates wars between his people and the Umayyad Emirate up towards the Pyrenees. Anyhow, a busy man, constantly trying to push the boundaries. He takes this role of Holy Roman Emperor that he resuscitates as a title very seriously. The wars against the Saxons lasted 33 years. So he's at war with various German tribes in Saxony for 33 years. When he finally crushes them, he needed to turn them into assimilated citizens. And so he demands by fiat as part of the settlement that they convert, which they do as political expedience. But what, you wonder, what the depth of a conversion would have been at the point of a sword at this point. But part of it is to try to destroy their devotion to the animist gods that we had addressed a couple of weeks ago in talking about the sorts of religion that the Germans brought with them, and what the nature of their gods may have been like. But apparently, and this is a quote from the great biographer Einhard of Charlemagne, or in German, Eginhard, the war that had lasted so many years was at length ended by their acceding to the terms offered by the king, which were renunciation of their national religious customs and the worship of devils, acceptance of the sacraments of the Christian faith and religion, and union with Franks to form one people. So he sends people in, this is the sort of thing that Boniface did, to destroy their great pillars. They seem to often have Saxon religion centered on trees and sacred groves, and he would send people in to cut them down. My God is stronger than your God. And so the great pillar Irminsul, the name given to the physical representation of the god, the war god Irminsul, is cut down. In an episode mentioned in numerous chronicles, he has it destroyed. And this is where I point out that in Act 2, Scene 3 of Vincenzo Bellini's great bel canto Druid opera Norma, and in that scene, it's placed at the temple of Irminsul. So Bellini conflates Druids with Saxons in this regard. So religious conversion was a useful tool, but again, this doesn't mean that there is depth to the conversion, and that will go on for a century or two. Charlemagne and the Abbasids, the enemy of my enemy. At opposite ends of the world, the Carolingians and Abbasids establish a loose military alliance against nearby mutual threats, the Umayyad Emirate and the Byzantine Empire. So nothing much comes of it, but it's sort of a word in the ear, a little bird in the ear of Cordoba and in the ear of Constantinople. We could throw our lot in with these other folks who are on the other side of your property, and this is a way of obliging you to play nice closer to home. This is a 19th century painting, but the romantic elements in emissaries coming from the Franks to the Caliph in Baghdad is captured. We have a Christian at the court of the Caliph pointing to, oh, here are those wild Franks I've told you about. I can't imagine what it looked like to any Franks, what Baghdad looked like. We do know later on, when under Otto in the 10th century, they send a couple of emissaries to the emperor at Constantinople, that they're cowed by the scene of Constantinople. Again, the level of material wealth in these other places would be something unimaginable to Germans making their first appearance on the world scene since the fall of the Roman Empire in the West. So Charlemagne's empire, on the map on the left, I've included a map of modern Europe to give you a picture of what in the modern world would have been paying at least lip service to the Frankish Empire and in the year 800. So in the later lavender here, we have the direct Frankish kingdom. It includes Italy. It includes the northern Italy. It includes southern France all the way across the Pyrenees, Gascony, Brittany, not the part of Brittany that was still in Celtic control. His main palace would have been up here in Aachen, which, if we transpose, would now be on. If we look over here, would now be, is Aachen now in Belgium? It's near Cologne, which is just into West Germany in the modern world. Frisia up in the Netherlands, Thuringia, and these holdings are Slavic, but they are tributary to Charlemagne's, which means that they're paying him money to leave them alone. So he's taxing them. The Duchy of Benevento is still intact here. It's in Germany. Okay. It's Aix-la-Chapelle in French, because in different periods in history, France was claiming it. Anyhow, the Rhine, which is the border here in red, would have been, if we look at this map, is down here. So much of what we think of as modern Germany is part of the Frankish kingdom. So I mentioned down here, his kingdom spans the Rhine. They're the same people with different vernacular languages. And while I'm on the topic of language as a first mention, understand that there is no such thing as national culture at this point. These towns that we're looking at, Worms, Metz, Regensburg, these places were maybe a couple of thousand people, tops. Most people lived in rural settings on the estates and domains of grand lords. The dialects spoken at different places around the empire. Even if you're on the west side of the Rhine, the different Latinate or Romance versions of dialect that were probably spoken west of the Rhine. When people ask what language natively, I mean, we know that he could speak Latin, which was the literary language at the time. But when they ask what language Charlemagne spoke, historians will say that it was Rhenish Romance, meaning a brand of Proto-French that would have been spoken close to the Rhine. And they can say not much else about it. The linguists these days can, but we will see. He gets crowned as the Emperor of the Romans. And this is a dramatic development because he didn't want to be crowned. In other words, Charlemagne was not willing to make the concession that the papacy had been promoting for several centuries now, that they were the central power who got to bestow the imperial crown themselves, that it came from them, that they had primacy, that the church had primacy, that given the two swords theory that we spoke about a couple classes ago, which paired the spiritual authority of the church with the temporal power of the empire, that it was the spiritual authority that had preeminence. And the papacy did everything in its power to symbolically present themselves as the ones that were giving this to him as their own, out of their own good graces. So again, it was The rivalry was Pope versus Emperor. The unanswered question was who had preeminence. Pepin and Charlemagne regarded themselves, Frankish kings, as at the top of the Christian pyramid. They were the ones who saved, protected, and supported the papacy and the city of Rome. The Pope, as the vicar of Christ, regarded kingship as something he bestowed and anointed in the name of the church. Fortuitously, in the year 800, Constantinople was in the control of an empress who had been the regent, Irene of Athens. This was used as an excuse by the Pope to regard the imperial throne as vacant. The Emperor of Constantinople was still considered to be the emperor of the Roman Empire. And this gave the Pope an excuse to say that throne, since Irene is now in power in Constantinople for this very short period, I will use the opportunity on Christmas Day in the year 800 and St. Peter's, because Charlemagne had been visiting Rome. Leo III, as legend has it, sneaks up on him at a point in the Mass, sort of grabs a crown. This sounds much too implausible to be true, but sneaks up on Charlemagne and crowns him Imperator Romanorum. You are the emperor of the Romans. From this point, the West regarded the Roman Empire as intact. This is now the Western claim. The East was not very happy with this development, happy with the idea that in the West, they now considered Charles the Holy Roman Emperor. So what's significant? So a growing rift had already existed between the papacy and the East. And now it's exacerbated. And the rift, there were two reasons for the rift. In mainly the 7th century into the early 8th, the Greek church had been witnessed a struggle between so-called iconoclasts, image breakers, who believed that icons and representations of saints and Christ and Mary were idolatrous, and that churches should be stripped down to Puritan simplicity. They were opposed by the so-called iconodules, the slaves of icons, who eventually win out. But Latin Christianity, with its need to appeal to Germans and a much more primitive sensibility, never went for icon breaking or the removal of icons. They needed the outward trappings, the visualizations of animist religion. They needed saints whose pictures you could look at, whose bones you could touch. They needed relics as pagan as that might have looked to iconoclasts. The other argument, by the way, of some historians is that the successes of Islam with its own aversion to images may have impressed the iconoclasts. They may be on to a better idea here. The second principle of a growing rift was that in the West, they had added the so-called filioque clause to the creed that theologically said that the Holy Spirit or the Holy Ghost proceeds from the Father, filioque, and from the Son together, which exalts the depiction of Christ in the Trinity. And this will come to a head so that in the 11th century, there'll be a formal break over the filioque clause, and the Pope will excommunicate the patriarchs of Constantinople as heretics. And this is a breach that has never been undone to this day. There's essentially not much that would prohibit the Roman Catholic Church, the Roman Church, and the Orthodox churches from reaffiliating themselves. This is one of the things that stands in the way theologically to this day. And the other significant point in this coronation of Charles is that the papacy and the emperor each claim precedence and will continue to do so. So I just show images through history from different points of medieval, Renaissance, earlier medieval, later medieval, Renaissance, post-Renaissance depictions of the coronation of Charlemagne. It is a great cultural trope that is just used everywhere, and including, this is from the workshop of Raphael. And the reason I use it here is that later on, it's used by the Renaissance popes. Here's Leo X bestowing the crown on Francis I as a way of trying to establish influence with the French monarchy in the 16th century. So using the imagery of Charlemagne to make a later point. And this is at the Apostolic Palace in Vatican City. Anyhow, and there was an intellectual renaissance under Charlemagne, which we should take a peek at. So the focus of the dynasty was on the cultivation of what they regarded as a backward, and with good reason, semi-literate and quasi-Christian population. And what did they have at their disposal? Monks and monasteries. These were the weaponry. And they used them to develop better Latinists as court scribes, because there now is the first inchoate attempt at building an administrative infrastructure. Charlemagne tries to develop a political bureaucratic infrastructure, and he needs court scribes. And they have to be able to read passable Latin. To preserve the received intellectual tradition of the ancient world, both the Christian patristic literature, the literature of the fathers of the church, and the classical texts, they were going to need more and more able scribes at the disposal of the court, as well as at the disposal of the monasteries, to do that ongoing vocation of preservation, and to simplify, clarify, and accelerate manuscript and book production. And we'll talk about how they did that. And central in this, Charles imports lots of monastic scholars. The most famous one is the great Alcuin of York, comes from that corner of northern England that descends from Viking settlement. So Alcuin of York arrives on the scene. He becomes the master of the palace school at Aachen. He becomes a tutor of Charles. He perfects a new script called Carolingian minuscule, and this is monumental. It's a new script of upper and lowercase letters that make these manuscripts much more legible, more copyable, more easier to produce. And I'll have samples of it on the next slide. But here we have pictures of Alcuin. He's dedicating a book. And here's Alcuin tutoring the king from a manuscript. So, and again from Einhard, we have this quote. Charles was not satisfied with command of his native language merely, but gave attention. Notice he says command of his native language. He doesn't even tell you what the native language was. I guess that's presumed. But gave attention to the study of foreign ones and was such a master of Latin that he could speak it as well as his native tongue, which is saying something. But he could understand Greek better than he could speak it. So he had sort of a non-speaking command of Greek. Alcuin, the greatest scholar of the day, was his teacher in other branches of learning. The king spent much time and labor with him studying rhetoric, dialectics, especially astronomy. He learned to reckon, and he used to investigate the motions of the heavenly bodies most curiously with an intelligent scrutiny. He also tried to write. Notice this, he was literate, but he uses the phrase, he tried to write, and used to keep tablets and blanks in bed under his pillow, that at leisure hours he might accustom his hand to form the letters. However, as he did not begin his efforts in due season, but late in life, they met with ill success. So he wasn't good at writing, which is typical of the period. So on this slide, so here is a sample. It's larger. Here is an actual sample of the minuscule, upper and lowercase letters, and they're pretty recognizable, are they not? To the point that I actually took a line out of a manuscript and reproduced it up here. It's the fifth verse of the first chapter of the Gospel of Luke. And if you look at the Latin, that's a capital F here in the thing, but you can actually fuit in diebus Herodes regis Judae sacerdos. In the time of Herod, king of Judea, there was a priest. So here you are looking at an 8th or early 9th century, call it early 9th century manuscript line, which without much trouble you could read, as long as they weren't using the systematic abbreviations that they tended to use. But this was a period in which they began to aim at legibility and simplicity. So from his world came, I can't make this any larger, but this, as you see up close, this gospel page is legible. You still have the glorious illuminations. Here are the 4 evangelists, and it was in codex form. So welcome to the land of books rather than scrolls. We have moved on to that point in time when they became much handier. It's interesting the way the book still hasn't been displaced, really, despite our Kindles and the like. It's still the handiest way for flipping back and forth. So what you have here is legitimately high levels of cultural achievement. High, as I say, but thin. Not many people would have been in circumstances outside of a monastery or an episcopal, a bishop's court, or the palace court itself. Would there have been people who were capable of this level of literacy? So high culture is maintained at a cost, but lots of resources have got to be poured into it. And not only is it not universal, but we're talking 3 to 5% of the population. I am sure that, the Count of Anjou could not read. in this period. He was fairly adept at busting heads, I'm sure, but that was the full extent of it. Outside major abbeys and court school, the Carolingian world was rural, isolated, poor, illiterate. There was art beyond text illumination. So some samples. This is from the Lord's Gospels. This is ivory carved as a cover. I don't know whether modern scholarship tells us much about the craftspeople, the training of craftspeople who got to do this kind of work, this level of work. Is this something that could be transmitted within certain abbeys? Did they have to import people from southern Italy, from Byzantine locations to be able to do this sort of thing? Or from Spain for that matter? Here we have gold work, the cover of the Codex Aureus, the gold book. Here is crystal carving, which is astonishing work for the 9th century, but they had the skill. What were there? Were there 3 people in the entire empire capable of that? Who knows? And of course, the Lord's Gospels themselves had this wonderful cartoony-like illumination tradition. Down here, we have the Lothair crystal. We have a brooch. I don't know whether that was for a man or a woman's cloak. We have a roundel with a personified image of the moon, very German looking. We have a chalice done very much in sort of high Byzantine mode with all this gilt and silver work, the Tassilo chalice. So they were capable of quite a bit. It's just that, again, high culture, thin culture. In architecture, really, what we have, there aren't lots of things I can show you. There is in Aachen, the Palatine Chapel, and he clearly modeled this on San Vitale. It's got the octagonal structure. It's very derivative. I am sure when you look at, I only put one picture of it here because we've looked at San Vitale. When you look at the work, this was clearly using Byzantine craftspeople imported from southern Italy or from Ravenna itself, if there were still people who could support those skills in Ravenna, I'm not sure. When we look at northern work from the period, we do see at some of the abbeys brickwork, pre-Romanesque in style, but you see the beginnings of Romanesque Roman arches being used. And there really aren't a lot of these stone and brick buildings that we can point at from the earliest period. Once we get another century or two, things will pop up all over the place. And there'll be lots of examples of everything. The level of material development is still extremely, extremely primitive. The only stone buildings would be in abbeys, churches, even in the capital of Aachen, there wouldn't be that much. And to that point, this is a recreated model that I included here of the palace complex at Aachen, and subtract the church out, the interior of which we were just looking at, subtract the church out, and basically, you're looking at a well-tended Yorkshire farm, a farmstead. The height of luxury and art in the West in the early 19th century doesn't look all that impressive in its reconstruction. The fact that this was stonework, was amazing at the time. And by the way, what I call it a palace complex. Charlemagne and his family tended to use a palace network. So they couldn't stay in one place for too long. First of all, he had a large military force that he wanted to keep on the move, and he went with them. So he moved with administrative scribal schools with him around France and Germany. They progressed around. So he had a number of places where he could stay for a while, because supporting the palace was not something that a local rural society could do very easily. Trying to keep a center, there are no towns of note. What did we say Rome by 800 was? 25,000 people? That's Rome. Paris, if it existed at this point, would have been 3,000. At tops, you could not, there was not the kind of extensive trade in agricultural products by which you could import huge amounts of supplies to support a court. So you move the court, as it were. Anyhow, after he dies, kingdom goes to his son, Louis the Pious, and Louis divides it at the end of his reign into 3 units. So 3 children, they each get a slice. Charles the Bald is going to get West Francia. Lothar is going to get the middle piece, the middle of which is called Lotharingia, from which we get the modern Lorraine, from Lothar. And Louis the German is going to get East Francia, which is going to become the center of the Holy Roman Empire and West Germany later on. So he divides it in 3 for organizational purposes, and I'll talk about those purposes in a bit. But has designated Lothar as emperor, and the other 2 brothers don't like it. So they battle it out for a little bit. And finally, before it gets too bloody, they make an agreement and they exchange vows, the famous oaths of Strasbourg, which are going to be the foundation for the Treaty of Verdun in 843. And the reason I include that as, well, there's 2 reasons. One is to show the fragmentation of empire, because you could not keep it supported as one. You just, for reasons we'll talk about, it was simply insupportable. But also because the oaths were taken in 2 languages, so that Charles on the French side swears in German, so that the knights of Louis the German can understand what he's swearing to. And Louis swears in this Proto-French, this Romance version, so that the troops, the knights of Charles, can understand what Louis is saying. And I want you just to compare these 2. So on the German side, it's sort of recognizably an early form of German. En Gottes Minne, in des Christianes Volkes, in unser Bederer, Gealtnisse von Tesemo Daga, Framordes so fram so mir Gott, so had ich Tesan minen Bruder. And the Romance version, I won't even know how to pronounce this. This is such a sort of a slush of, you'll see phrases and words that look like they're Latin, others that look like they're French, and others that look like they're Spanish or perhaps Italian. Pro Deo amor et pro Christian poblo et nostro commun sauvement, disti dien ovon incon Deus savir et poder me donat. I don't know what to make of it, but clearly, we see languages in formation, and this formation is going to take quite a while, because until you can establish the sort of cultural infrastructure that allows civilization to be more than local, people are going to be lodged in local dialects that are going to mutate faster than a coronavirus. And that will be the case for a couple of centuries yet. Certainly the various versions of Latin collapsing into Italian and the southern domains of Lothar here, I am sure no one at the peasant level in this part of Tuscany could understand anything that any knights of Lothar could speak in who wandered down that far in this period. Anyhow, so what we have then, we have an empire that is incredibly, it's making an attempt to reestablish something that had collapsed in the West with the fall of Rome. And it does begin a kind of cultural consolidation through Christianization, through the development of a high culture that's in common to all these places, but it is still under tremendous external threat. It's still decentralized, it's still localized, and indeed the Carolingian Empire, by the time we get to the end of the 19th century, its power had devolved to local warlords who could provide protection locally or not, but they could at least try, because what we're going to see, I've got them color-coded here, but if I blow up the map, these orangey lines are Viking raids all through the 8th and 9th century. You see them smashing into England and Ireland. Oh, there's Kells, by the way, the Book of Kells up here on the map. Thank you, everyone. You see them slamming into France. You see them slamming into spots and harassing even Seville, even Lisbon, even Compostela. You have, by the way, I don't show it on this map except a little bit up here. I didn't make the map big enough. They invade Russia, the Varangians. They make it to the Black Sea. Vikings become an honored guard among the Rus in the 10th century. They create such havoc. They eventually establish their own kingdom, Normandy, in northwestern France. But we're a little ahead of that yet. Then we have, in the same period, Saracen incursions from Tunis mainly, taking Sardinia, taking Sicily, and indeed the Islamic occupation of Sicily in the 9th century probably was the high point of cultural achievement in Sicily for the next 1,000 years. Again, we're a little ahead of ourselves. They take over the holdings of the Byzantine Empire in southern Italy. And then later on, the Hungarian incursions, which take place later, they are largely a threat to Byzantium, but they start threatening what's left over of the Carolingian Empire. And it's not till Otto the Great establishes the Ottonian Holy Roman Empire of the Germans that there's real resistance to the Hungarians. And so what you get is a world that is thrown not entirely into chaos, but one that can present central political powers that can protect local areas from incursion. So you have the development of things like, which we will look at next class, these armed farms in southern Italy, armed manors in France, little citadels, bourgs, boroughs, as the English come to call them later on, little fortified places to resist Viking incursions, to resist Saracen incursions, little garrisons that can protect the local area. So trust could be placed in the local chieftain more than in some central emperor or king miles away who could never respond in time to the chaos being wrought locally. So Viking attacks preying on monasteries and town settlements plagued the entire eastern seaboard. They raid Paris in 845, and in the 10th century will colonize Normandy. Saracen Raiders, major threat to Sicily, Sardinia, and Benevento. They effectively close off the Mediterranean to the Carolingians. In the 9th century, they colonized Malta, Sicily, parts of southern Italy, and the Magyars, as I said, in the 10th century. Effective centralized states, nation states, will not be possible in the West until advances are made in material culture and urbanization, and the political system we call feudalism develops. So two things are going to develop: a political system, which we'll talk about next time, called feudalism, and much increased urbanization, which will have a profound effect on the world that will then begin to look like what we will call Europe later on. So, final slide. After the Carolingians. So again, I want to highlight instability, decentralization, and localism. And I present two maps. The west of the old Carolingian Empire, which becomes the Kingdom of France under the Capetian dynasty, beginning with Hugh Capet towards the end of the 10th century. And look at what we see. The Capetians themselves, let me blow this up a little bit, they control these little royal domains near Paris. Okay, here, 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 and here. Outside of that, it's a world where the king can hardly leave Paris because of the robber barons who've got castles even near Paris. He'll have no control, or virtually, he will be king over, in name, over the dukes of Normandy and Gascony and Burgundy and Aquitaine and Brittany, and over the counts of Anjou and Toulouse, but he will not be the liege lord of their vassals. In other words, they will give him nominal precedence as king, but they don't particularly owe him money or troops or anything. And indeed, it moving up until really up until like the 12th century, the Duke of Aquitaine and the southern counts, the Count of Anjou, is more powerful than the King of France, his alleged lord. So these places are like central entry. Yes, they sort of share a language, but not quite, because it's really lots of separate languages. And they share a Christianity at this point, and they begin to share a high art tradition, but that's still fairly thinly spread. the Holy Roman Empire, unfortunately, I wanted this map, I wanted the equivalent of this map in English, and I could only find one in German. So you get the Königreich Frankreich, the kingdom of the Franks over here, and the Königreich of England and Poland and what have you. But the reason I have this map is to show you that for Otto and the Ottonian Empire, he might be now the German Holy Roman Emperor claiming the title, but these regional dukedoms, minor kingdoms, duchies, counties, they themselves, including Burgundy, is actually on his side of the world at this point. They really don't owe much to him. And so, as I say in the bullet up at the top, the main agenda for both the Capetian dynasty over here and the Ottonian dynasties over there is to consolidate power over the minor lords that they essentially have precedence over. But there's no state infrastructure that binds the dukes to the king other than in a ceremonial capacity. So with that said, I am going to stop the share. And I'm going to unpin myself. And there we have it. If you feel free to chat or unmute yourself to ask questions. And Kells, as somebody has looked up for us, thank you, Joy. Book of Kells was begun at Iona, which we knew, but the monks brought it to the abbey at Kells in County Meath. Okay, thank you. Questions, observations?
You know, it's funny. When I was listening to your presentation today, I was thinking about Gaul under the Romans and how it was split between the various different tribes, the Averni, the Alodu, the Sabine, all these tribes. And I was going to ask you, how did they bring the country together, give it some sort of national feel or unity under Charlemagne? And they really didn't, because the whole thing, after Charlemagne left, it was back to tribal again. They didn't call them tribes at that time. It was duchies and independences and such, but they were still completely separated out. They really never had developed much beyond that tribal situation that Caesar found.
Pretty true. The infrastructure for getting past that is what we're going to begin talking about next week. And the next course will, of course, really which will begin in April, I'm told, which is going to be called the High Middle Ages. Letting everybody know about that before this ends. Will address that quite formally, but also at this point, you could argue that there was at least one nod in the direction of a shared culture, and at least at the church and aristocratic level, and that was through the Latin language. So at least there was the rudiment of a shared culture as the vernaculars struggled to develop into what will later become literary languages. And in fact, languages like French and Italian and German and Dutch and what have you will not really reach a final stability until literary masterpieces develop in one or more of the major dialects. That's true of Spanish also. Castilian will become, of all the Romance languages, of which there were several in Spain at the time, will establish itself as the church and the crown and the literary developments all come into a merger. Italian is a fluke in that only because the Tuscan city-states, the courts in those states were so intellectually preeminent that you established one dialect as the leading dialect. And then Dante finally creates, if you will, the central text to establish it as the language.
I'm curious about the extraordinary art as in the Book of Kells. Where did they get that from? I mean, they must have copied it from somewhere. Was it from the Muslim? Was it from Istanbul?
I'm thinking
Constantinople?
I'm thinking two things. We know that there were Greek translators among them in some of the Irish abbeys. So I'm willing to believe that in the transfer of monasticism that took place in the jump from Egypt. Now, remember, in Alexandria, Egypt, you had a cultural center of the highest order near where that kind of ascetic monasticism develops. And I'm thinking the monasteries that migrated in the 5th century from there to Marseille, to near Marseille, and from there to Ireland, left an import tradition of scholarship and connection that allowed them to attract talent from that part of the world when going overland to the continent was no longer possible. So I'm guessing there was still naval connectivity between the Eastern Mediterranean, the southern coast of France, and Ireland that allowed that kind of talent to exist. And that then how much of it then gets transferred internally is another question. I'm way not well informed on this topic. I don't know how many cross-generational craftspeople would have existed. One would guess the Book of Kells produces about 800. Columba's abbeys were a going concern as early as 600. That's 2 centuries. I'm sure a lot of people who worked in the Book of Kells had to have been taught by people who were that skilled already or close to that level of accomplishment, who were on premises and were Irish at that point. We're not Greek imports at that point.
Thank you.
The Irish would have you believe that they've never lost the golden touch. At least that's what they tell me in the bars of Inwood.
Lou, I have a question about trade in these times. How did the exchange of goods occur? Was there a currency that was commonly thought to be the standard, the gold standard, so to speak? And
it depends which part of the world you're in. So certainly in the Eastern Mediterranean or in the Emirate of Cordoba, Charlemagne had issued his own currency. First of all, there wasn't currency, there were currencies. People accepted anything. So this is why you will find Carolingian coins turning up at like digs in Ireland. This is why, so for instance, when they dug up, did anybody see the film that I'd recommend very highly called The Dig? That's on Netflix now, about digging up the Anglo-Saxon site at Sutton Hoo in East Anglia. And one of the things they find early on are Merovingian coins. And the emissary from the British Museum goes over the moon and says, we had art, we had culture, we had money. It was French money, but it was money. But the local trade, though, was largely in goods. Now, one of the things I'm going to begin the next course talking about a bit is the build up of early cities and an urban bourgeoisie, and the skills and trade that you needed to support early urban settlement in really the northwest of France and into Holland and Frisia, and then into England, and in the other center, which would have been the northern Italian city-states.
Yeah. Will you cover how demand for products of other cultures or other countries developed, and therefore the need for more trade and the development of this?
I will try to do that. Certainly,
in a sense, more the creation of wealth.
In the beginning, local trade tends to start with very primitive exchanges of goods, and when you get into things like woolen trade, which begins to develop international relationships because of the ability to support sheep in certain locations in Europe and the ability to process it in other locations. Those skills are going to be supported and imported from largely the northern Italian cities. The fact is that Venice, Genoa, Pisa, later on Florence, they will begin, as we will see, to have commerce with both the Arab world, the Muslim world, and with Byzantium through periods when the rest of the northwest of Europe was still pretty much in its localist mode. Their models for how you begin to exchange goods, for using promissory notes as exchanges, for being able to support a commercial demand when you get to these places, a commercial demand at home for the products of these other places. That really takes centuries to develop, but does develop. It develops with impetus. So what is just at a crawl in the 10th century is noticeable in the 11th century, is galloping in the 12th century, and looks like a new world. You know, the only thing I can hold out as an image of what develops is looking at that little insignificant palace of Charlemagne built in, let's say, 800, and the fact that by 1050 you could build the Gothic church of Saint Denis in the first of the great Gothic churches in Paris in 2.5 centuries. That all of a sudden you're in a world that has managed to transform itself, that it could support that the burghers of English cities could support building these massive Gothic cathedrals that would have been places that could not have supported a cattle market just 200 years earlier. But it is a couple of hundred years that it takes to develop this kind of thing.
When did Marco Polo visit China and bring
Oh,
back?
that's really what, late
that late?
13th? Yeah.
That's later. Okay.
Yeah, but
thank you.
because he visits the Khans
Yeah.
and China, so that's
And the
much
Silk-
later.
And the Silk Road and all that. So
Yeah,
that's
yeah.
later.
And by that point, you understand, I mean, Venice, by the time of the Polos, Venice is already going downhill. Venice in its period of glory is of the 11th and 12th century. And when it gets to fund a crusade against Constantinople, little Venice gets to invade the greatest city of Eastern Christendom by bankrolling it, as we'll talk about when we get there. Anyhow, gang, this was fun.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Feudalism next week.
Thank you.
Okay, take care.
Yeah.